Well, thank you all for being here. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's reading and conversation with one of this country's most distinguished, highly acclaimed, and beloved authors. Pulitzer Prize winning poet and two-term poet laureate of the United States, Natasha Trethewey. Tonight is our third event in the Subir and Malini Chowdhury Foundation Distinguished Speakers Series. The first having been given in pre-COVID times by the masterful Michael Ondaatje, and most recently last November by the luminous Zadie Smith. I'd like to ask you now to join me with your applause in thanking the founders of the Chowdhury Foundation, Subir and Malini Chowdhury, who are here with us tonight. Subir and Malini, please stand. Tonight's event is also sponsored by the Dornsife Department of English, the USC Office of Academic Programs, and of course by Visions and Voices, the Arts and Humanities Initiative, and its media partner, KCRW. And now, to introduce Natasha Trethewey, let me welcome one of USC's own distinguished prize-winning writers, the author of 5 critically acclaimed books of fiction and nonfiction, including the novel Caucasia, a national bestseller and now called a modern classic. She's considered one of today's most widely respected voices concerning multiracial and complex social identities. Winner of the Whiting Writers Award and the 2016 Dos Passos Prize for Literature, please welcome Professor Danzy Senna.
Thank you so much, David. And I am really thrilled to have Natasha Trethewey with us tonight. She's, of course, one of our most accomplished and brilliant living writers. She and I are also old friends, and I'm always reminded when we speak of how much we share. Both of us, daughters of interracial couples who married in the wake of Loving versus State of Virginia, both children of poets, both having gotten into fistfights in our youth. And tonight, she's going to read from her profound memoir, Memorial Drive. Her language, as many of you already know, is subtle, lyrical, and wonderfully precise. She never says too much or too little. Her restraint doesn't so much conceal meaning as it does accentuate the heat and energy and purpose beneath her words. Whenever I read Natasha's work, I find myself luxuriating in not just the meaning she brings to matters of race, family, history, but by the care and attention she pays to language itself. And I'm quoting from her poem, Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke 2 laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, Miss in Mississippi. Natasha's work from the beginning has called on us to contend with the enormity of the primal wound, both the personal and historic, which we come to see as one and the same in her writing. In one of my favorite of her poems, Enlightenment, from her collection Thrall, She writes about going with her white father on a tour of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation. She writes, "Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other." Several years ago, Natasha told me about a book she was writing that didn't yet have a name, a book about her mother. We talked of it deep into the night. Years later, at the start of the quarantine, the outside world literally on fire, I received this book in the mail. I read it in one sitting. Memorial Drive has all the care and precision and beauty of her poetry, asking the question her mother poses to her in a dream, a vision. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? Like her poetry, Memorial Drive feels intimate and personal, but also like a metaphor for the violent origins of this nation itself. In the pages, we hear the story of domestic terror and survival, violence and love, but also we watch Natasha Trethewey, the girl, forging herself into being, into the writer. As she puts it, I had begun to compose herself. Here we see her as rebellious, willful, methodical, and always watching, the one who will notice and bear witness. We see it in the way she describes the light around her mother's head, the shape of her stepfather's feet, the way she describes her mother going to work at a bar called Underground Atlanta. I wrote Natasha an email after I finished reading her book, and I'm just going to quote from the email. "Maybe your ears were burning because I finished your book today and already wrote to Jericho about it. It is so beautifully and gorgeously constructed. Of course, reading it, I thought about our conversations at Breadloaf, about daring to go back into trauma, to speak of them, to turn life into art, the perils of not doing that work. In any case, you have created something truly transcendent on the page." I know we're all eager to hear Natasha read and discuss from her work, so I won't stay up here long, but I want to list a few of her tremendous accomplishments and honors. She has served 2 terms as the Poet Laureate of the United States, as well as the Laureate of the state of Mississippi. She's the author of 2 works of nonfiction, Memorial Drive and Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, as well as 5 collections of poetry. Monument, longlisted for the National Book Award, Thrall, Native Guard, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, Belloc's Ophelia, and Domestic Work, which won the Cave Canem Prize for the best first book by an African-American poet. She's the recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim and the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bunting Fellowship, a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets since 2019. She was awarded the 2020 Bobbitt Prize in Poetry for Lifetime Achievement from the Library of Congress. Currently, she is a Board of Trustees professor of English at Northwestern University. Please join me in a warm welcome for Natasha Trethewey.
Good evening. It's lovely to be here with you all tonight, and I thank you for coming and for inviting me here. I'm going to read tonight from my most recent book, a memoir titled Memorial Drive. It's a book about surviving traumas, both personal and national, about grief and the abiding love and enduring bond between a mother and child. Against that backdrop, it is ultimately a book about becoming a writer. Eudora Welty wrote often about the importance of place in a writer's development. Location, she wrote, is the crossroads of circumstance. I'm going to read a bit from the prologue and some of the first chapter that link the 2 locations at the crossroads of personal and national history. The last image of my mother, but for the photographs taken of her body at the crime scene, is the formal portrait made only a few months before her death. She sat for it in a mass market studio known for its competent but unremarkable pictures, babies coaxed to laughter by hand puppets, children in stair-step formation wearing matching Christmas sweaters, all against a common backdrop. Sometimes it's a sky blue scrim that looks as if it's been brushed with a feather, or an autumn scene of red and yellow leaves framing a post and rail fence. For moodier portraits, as if to convey a sense of seriousness or formal elegance, there's the plain black scrim. She was 40 years old. For the sitting, she'd chosen a long-sleeved black sheath, the high collar open at the throat. She does not look at the camera, her eyes fixed at a point in the distance that seems just above my head, making her face as inscrutable as it always was, her high, elegant forehead, smooth and unlined, a billboard upon which nothing is written. Nor does she smile, which makes the cleft in her chin more pronounced, her jawline softly squared above her slender neck. She sits perfectly erect without looking forced or uncomfortable. Perhaps she intended to look back on it years later and say, "That's where it began, my new life." I am struck with the thought that this is what she must have meant to do, document herself as a woman come this far, the rest of her life ahead of her. Hindsight makes me see the portrait differently now, how gloomy it is, as if the photographer meant to produce something artistic rather than an ordinary studio portrait. It's as if he made of the negative space around her a frame to foreground some difficult knowledge, the dark past behind her, her face lit toward a future upon which her gaze is fixed. And yet, undeniably, something else is there, elegiac even then, a strange corner of light just behind her head, perhaps the photographer's mistake, appearing as though a doorway has opened, a passage through which, turning, she might soon depart. Looking at it now, with all I know of what was to come, I see what else the photographer has done. He shot her like this, her black dress black as the scrim behind her, so that, but for her face, she is in fact part of that darkness, emerging from it as from the depths of memory. Nearly 30 years after my mother's death, I went back for the first time to the place she was murdered. I'd not been there since the year I turned 19, when I had to clean out her apartment, disposing of everything I could not or would not carry with me. All the furniture and household items, her clothing, her large collection of records. I kept only a few of her books, a heavy belt made of bullets, and a single plant she had loved, a Dieffenbachia. Throughout my childhood, it had been my responsibility to tend it, every week dusting and misting the upper leaves and snipping the browned lower ones. "Be careful when you handle it," my mother warned. A small precaution, seemingly unnecessary, but there is a toxin in the sap of the Dieffenbachia. It oozes from the leaves and the stems where they are cut. Dumb cane, the plant is called, because it can cause a temporary inability to speak. Struck dumb, we say, when fear or shock or astonishment renders us mute. Dumb grief, when the grief is not expressed in uttered words. I could not then grasp the inherent metaphor of the plant, my relationship with my mother, what it would mean that she had made its care my duty while warning me of its danger. When I left Atlanta, vowing never to return, I took with me what I had cultivated all those years, mute avoidance of my past, silence and willed amnesia buried deep in me like a root. Nor could I have anticipated then that anything would ever draw me back to that city, to a geography that held at every turn a reminder of a past I was determined to forget, even as I tried to honor her memory in every way I knew how. Indeed, going back for work after accepting a university faculty position, I thought I could circumvent my former life, going out of my way to avoid at least the one place I could not bear to see, until I had to. To get there, I had to drive past landmarks that took me back to 1985, the county courthouse where the trials were held, the train station from which my mother traveled downtown to work, the DeKalb County Police Station at the intersection of Highway 285, the bypass loop around Metro Atlanta, and make my way down Memorial Drive, a major east-west artery once named Fair Street. It originates in the middle of the city, Memorial, and winds east from downtown, ending at Stone Mountain, the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy. A lasting metaphor for the white mind of the South, Stone Mountain rises out of the ground like the head of a submerged giant, the nostalgic dream of Southern heroism and gallantry emblazoned on its brow. In bas-relief, the enormous figures of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Not far from its base is the apartment we lived in that last year at the 5400 block of Memorial, number 18D. Though I knew exactly where it was, knew the landmarks leading up to it, I drove right past it first and had to double back to enter the tree-lined front gate. From there, I could see Stone Mountain in the distance, suddenly visible where Memorial crests, as if to remind me what is remembered here and what is not. The last time I was at the apartment complex, the morning after her death, I could see the faded chalk outline of her body on the pavement, the yellow police tape still stuck to the door, the small round hole in the wall beside her bed where a single bullet, a missed shot, had lodged. Nothing in the landscape today bears evidence to any of that, though everything seems to carry the imprint of loss. I keep an image in my head of myself from that first day after her death at the apartment. There's a video recording of my arrival made by a local news station, and so the image is not only of those few moments, but of watching myself from a distance, entering my former life for what I thought to be the last time. In the footage, I walk up the stairs to the door and step in, shutting it behind me. When I think of it now, I don't hear any words, the volume on mute. Perhaps the reporter spoke our names, or perhaps she did not, calling my mother victim instead. And in my mind's eye, a caption fills the bottom of the screen. It identifies me as daughter of the murdered woman. Even then, I felt as though I were watching someone else, a young woman on the cusp of her life, adulthood and bereavement gripping her at once. The young woman I'd become, walking out of that apartment hours later, was not the same one who went into it. It's as if she's still there, that girl I was, behind the closed door, locked in the footage where it ends. Often, I've seen that doorway in my dreams. Only now is it a threshold I can cross. The first chapter begins with an epigraph from Shakespeare's Sonnet Number 3 that reads, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." Another country. In the spring of 1966, when I was born, my mother was a couple of months shy of her 22nd birthday. My father was out of town traveling for work, so she made the short trip from my grandmother's house to Gulfport Memorial Hospital as planned without him. On her way to the segregated ward, she could not help but take in the tenor of the day, witnessing the barrage of rebel flags lining the streets, private citizens, lawmakers, Klansmen, often one and the same, raising them in Gulfport and small towns all across Mississippi. The 26th of April that year marked the 100th anniversary of Mississippi's celebration of Confederate Memorial Day, a holiday glorifying the Old South, the Lost Cause, and white supremacy. And much of the fervor was a display, too, in opposition to recent advancements in the civil rights movement. She could not have missed the paradox of my birth on that particular day, a child of miscegenation, and interracial marriage still illegal in Mississippi and in as many as 20 other states. Sequestered on the colored floor, my mother knew the country was changing, but slowly. She had come of age in the summer of 1965, turning 21 in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the Watts riots, and years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi. Unlike my father, who'd grown up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, hunting and fishing, free to roam the open woods, my mother had come into being a black girl in the Deep South, hemmed in, bound to a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. Though my father believed in the idea of living dangerously, the necessity of taking risks, my mother had witnessed the necessity of dissembling, the art of making of one's face an inscrutable mask before whites who expected of blacks a servile deference. In the summer of 1955, when she was 11 years old, she'd seen what could happen to a black child in Mississippi who had not behaved as expected, stepping outside the confines of racial prescription. In my grandmother's copy of Jet magazine, Emmett Till's battered remains, his destroyed face. Even had my mother wanted to ignore the racial violence and increasing turbulence around her, my grandmother would not allow it. In her house, the latest issue of Jet lay on the coffee table beside a book of documentary photographs of the civil rights movement, images ranging from lynchings to peaceful protests and the resilient faces of Black Americans, constant reminders of the necessity of fighting for justice in a state where the external reminders were increasingly unavoidable. The year before my mother met my father, the civil rights activist Medgar Evers had been gunned down in his driveway in Jackson. That year, 1963, my grandmother joined a group of black citizens in the Biloxi Wade Inn to protest being denied the right to use the public beaches. To mourn Evers, the protesters placed hundreds of black flags in the sand, an image my mother, watching from the seawall, would not forget. Nor would she forget hearing the news of the 3 civil rights activists working on the Freedom Summer campaign to register black voters in Mississippi. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had been abducted and murdered in June 1964, their bodies found 2 months later, buried under the weight of an earthen berm in Neshoba County. When the news reached her, my mother was out of the state on a field trip with her college theater troupe. Back home, the Ku Klux Klan had initiated its campaign of terror, the Mississippi she returned to having grown even more frightening. That summer was a season of fires, of danger coming ever closer, flaming crosses and black churches burning all around the state. My mother and grandmother, living across the street from a church, slept less soundly then, awakening often in the night to listen. It was against that backdrop of imminence and upheaval that my parents, both college students at the time, fell in love. They met in a literature course on modern drama, and their conversations on books and theater propelled them from the classroom out into the afternoon sunlight as they walked the campus and beyond, among the rolling green hills of Kentucky. When they eloped in 1965, traveling across the Ohio River into Cincinnati, where it was legal for them to be married. Only my mother fully understood what this might mean for me, the child she was already carrying. In letters to my father during their months apart, she was at once sanguine and practical, hoping for a changing nation, but also aware that any child she brought into the world would have much to learn in order to be safe. That meant I would need to understand the realities I would face, the painful, oppressive facts of a place slow to accept integration, even as it was now the law of the land. My father, idealistic in nature, was still naive enough to believe I could grow up as free of the burdens of race, of blackness, that is, as he was. They complemented each other, as opposites do. My mother, graceful and reserved, attentive to details. My father, with his rough manners, rowdy and bookish at once, often distracted by his thoughts. It was my mother who stanched the blood on my cheek when, after watching my father shaving, I tried using his straight razor. It had been my father, absent-minded, who'd left the razor on the counter within my reach. One day, when I cut my knee in the ditch outside, revealing what appeared to be a layer of white skin underneath, I lay between them, holding their hands up side by side, asking why they weren't the same color, why I didn't match either of them exactly. What was I? You have the best of both worlds, they told me, not for the first time. Out in the world, alone with either of them, I was just beginning to feel a profound sense of dislocation. If I was with my father, I measured the polite responses from white people, the way they addressed him as sir or mister, whereas my mother would be called gal, never miss or ma'am, as I had been taught was proper. So different was the treatment I received with each of them that I was unsure where or how I belonged. Only at home, the three of us together, did I feel profoundly theirs. And in that trinity of mother, father, and child, I would shut my eyes and fall asleep on the high bed between them. Outside that bedroom was a long, narrow hallway leading to the den and, just inside the door, a tall bookcase that held my attention countless afternoons. It housed my parents' books, along with a set of encyclopedias my mother had insisted my grandmother purchase instead of bronzing my baby shoes to commemorate my birth. In the earliest dream I can recall, that hallway led to something unknown by which I was both drawn and vaguely frightened, a hint of danger that lay before me. In the dream, I woke to a house so dark and quiet it seemed I was alone. I rose then and stood in the doorway, peering down the length of the hall. Opposite me, at the other end, blocking the bookcase, was a figure the size of a man, faceless and made entirely of the crushed shells that covered the driveway beside our house, the sharp edges I'd walked over barefoot countless times. It makes sense to me now that my earliest recollected dream took on such a shape. By then, my father was in graduate school part-time, working on his PhD in English, becoming a writer. Had I told him what frightened me, he might have reminded me as a comfort that the imagery resembles some of the stories he recited to me at bedtime, the trials of Odysseus, his encounter with the Cyclops blocking the exit to the cave, the monster Grendel at the entrance to the mead hall in the legend of Beowulf. Beyond those tales were the stories of Narcissus, Icarus, Cassandra, the riddle of the Sphinx, stories about bravery, vanity, hubris, knowledge. The language of allegory and metaphor undergirded our days. My father believed, as the poet Robert Frost cautioned, that one must have a thorough education in figurative language. What I am pointing out, Frost wrote, is that unless you are at home in the metaphor, Unless you have had your proper poetical education in the metaphor, you are not safe anywhere, because you are not at ease with figurative values. You don't know the metaphor and its strength and its weakness. You are not safe in science. You are not safe in history. My mother, who'd majored in literature and theater in college, must have believed as well in the necessity of an education in metaphor. And yet, she was the direct one, less interested in abstractions and figures of speech than in more practical lessons, admonishments about dangers I could not yet imagine. I remember long walks with my father along the railroad tracks, the sounds of poetry he'd recite as I picked flowers or blackberries for my mother. We'd gather pennies we left for the trains to flatten, and I'd walk with them clutched in my hands until my palms held the memory of every childhood scrape and cut, the familiar scent of blood. At home, my mother would have corn pudding waiting for us, the kitchen warm and fragrant. On the windowsill, the jar of flowers I'd picked caught the afternoon sun and held it like bottled light, everything a marvel, crawfish building chimneys, pellet by pellet above their burrows, machinery at the shipyard and the great locomotives lurching at the railroad switch, the rhythm of language and the power of words to alter what I saw. "Look out that window," my father said. He had been entertaining me with a wolf hand puppet and the story of Little Red Riding Hood. "See that wolf out there?" he asked, pointing to my great Aunt Sugar, who was, at that moment, transformed, a wolf in a day dress and hat, walking upright through the woods behind our house. Even my mother, shelling peas at the kitchen sink, had looked outside and laughed. We were safe. Nothing outside would harm us. This was the place of my childhood wonder, of my parents' fleeting happiness, my unquestioning belief that my life would always be just as it was then, in the close arrangement of daily life with my mother's family. We lived with my grandmother right next door to my Aunt Sugar on the small plot of land where my great-grandmother's house had stood. Surrounding us was a wider radius of people who'd grown up with my elders, many of them, like us, charting their family history back to when the small section of town called North Gulfport had been a settlement of former slaves. There was the community center, built by Mennonite missionaries, where I took swimming lessons, an Elks Lodge where Uncle Son had been a member since the 50s, several churches, and just as many small nightclubs and juke joints, including Son's Owl Club, where my mother, as a girl, had helped choose records for the jukebox, and where my grandmother had worked the kitchen on weekends, making gumbo or red beans and rice. There was also a baseball field where Son's team played, my father as catcher, the only white player on the diamond. Down the street, the Gulf and Ship Island line ran north and south toward Jackson, beside old Highway 49. Just a few yards from my grandmother's house, flanking her driveway, was the new Highway 49, a busy four-lane road stretching over what had been a pasture. At night, I could hear the sound of a train going by from one direction, the long whistle as it met the crossing at the Four Corners, and on the other side, the rumble of 18-wheelers that shook the ground and rattled our windows. Nestled between the two, our tiny patch of native geography seemed, to my child's eye, vast. When I began to go out with both my parents, outside of the confines of North Gulfport, to a store or to the movie theater, I watched the ways white people responded to us. That my parents were beautiful would have been reason enough to stare. But in Mississippi, in the late 60s and early 70s, it had been only a few years since the beaches were integrated to comply with national law, and the schools were yet to be fully desegregated across the state. Ross Barnett, the former governor, was monitoring interracial activity and my grandmother had been on the list of people to watch ever since she tried to place my parents' 1965 wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Separation of the races was still the way of things, maintained by custom, if not upheld by law, and my parents and I met with a great deal of hostility most places we went. I could see it on the faces of the white people we encountered, how even the nicer ones just shook their heads, whispering, "Such a cute little thing, too bad she's black." How others stared at us, sucking their teeth. Sometimes this hostility turned to outright intimidation, someone following us out of Woolworth's to the car, my mother gripping my father's arm to prevent him turning around and engaging the man behind us, someone else driving slowly by the house, glaring at us as we sat on the front porch, a group of 3 or 4 men accosting my father on his way home from work on the docks, asking, "What's wrong with you? Why you livin' among the niggers?" My mother and grandmother, having lived with this kind of attention, were accustomed to scrutiny and intimidation, a stream of headlights searching the front windows of the house at night, the sexually charged calls from white men driving by in broad daylight. In the late 50s and early 60s, my grandmother had given shelter to several Mennonite missionaries who came to North Gulfport to teach, repair the dilapidated housing of the very poor, and minister to the community. For weeks at a time, these young white missionaries would stay at her house, and it wasn't long before their presence and the work they were doing was noticed by local whites. First, there was a bomb threat directed at the Bible camp where the Mennonites were believed to be promoting integration, the camp my mother attended. Then, the Ku Klux Klan threatened to bomb the Mount Olive Baptist Church across the street. Undeterred, my grandmother began to sleep with a pistol beneath her pillow. In spite of the danger, she was adamant in her belief that she must do this work, must open her doors to help, a moral obligation, she called it. Though my mother and grandmother met all of this with a similar stoicism, they responded differently. My mother was averse to guns, to confrontation, whereas my grandmother saw guns as a necessity, telling me countless times the way to confront a would-be intruder. "First, fire a warning shot," she said, "and if they keep coming, aim at the legs, shoot to wound." Those words marked my first awareness that any danger we might face was not limited to the world outside our close-knit community, the radius of those houses, but could come right to us, right up into the yard, perhaps even the front door. Though I was too young to recall the night the Klan burned a cross in our driveway, I heard the story again and again, and the night lives in my memory as experience. I see it as though watching a scene in a documentary, silent but for the metal box fan in the window, a whirring sound like an old movie projector. The men arrived late in the evening, long after supper. My parents still sitting together in the den, watching television. My grandmother and my Uncle Charlie in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes. All of them dead now. I see them moving through the house like ghosts. Even I am a ghost in this story, an infant self of whom I have no recollection, my inscrutable face still white as my father's. My grandmother peers through the blinds at the group of them, 7 or 8 men in white robes carrying a man-sized cross. In the bedroom, my mother watches over me, the blackout curtains drawn, all the lights in the house extinguished so that, but for the faint glow of a hurricane lamp in the corner, we are all in darkness. My father and uncle, rifles in hand, waiting silently in the front room as, outside, the fire ignites. In my grandmother's house, the act of remembering, recounting that story, was meant to ensure my future safety, protection gained through knowledge and the vigilance it brings, a certain hyper-awareness, hair rising on the back of my neck when I'd hear a particular kind of Southern accent, a tensing in my spine when I'd see the Confederate flag or the gun rack on a truck following us too closely down the road. Within the tight circle of extended family, with their watchful interventions into my daily life, I felt protected, insulated from racial intimidation and violence, regardless of the ferment all around us. That so many of my relatives were around made the routine absences of my father less pronounced. It was part of the natural order of things that he would be gone for some time, following which I'd see him for a while before he departed again. A year after I was born, he had taken a commission as an officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, and after his initial training in British Columbia, spent most of 1967 and part of 1968 on a destroyer, the Centennial, cruising around the world to commemorate Canada's 100th anniversary. One of the few photographs I have of the three of us together is a formal portrait taken in 1969 in my grandmother's den. It was the last photograph we'd take together as a family. My father sitting on a wooden armchair, my mother balanced on the arm, her long legs crossed, and me between them, puckish in a green dress. I see in that photograph now my grandmother's desire for commemoration. Most pictures we had were snapshots taken casually, but for this one, my grandmother had called in a photographer. 2 years after the Supreme Court had ruled in Loving v. Virginia that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional, it was as if she wanted the formality of a professional portrait to make visible the legitimacy of my parents' union, our family, in a place where we were still seen as an aberration. My father had a different kind of commemoration in mind. In the aftermath of the Loving decision, he'd wanted to take a trip somewhere where our color differences might be less noticeable, where my mother might be able to relax. Ignoring her qualms about the dangers of a long journey over 1,000 miles, my father bought a used Lincoln Continental to get us to Mexico. I have a vague recollection of the seemingly endless stretch of blacktop, how that long car seemed to float above it as I dozed on the back seat. The sun hung low and heavy as we drove toward it. We were still 3 years from the end of their marriage, but the best of our days together already lay behind us in the darkening distance. What has stayed with me vividly from that trip, inscribed in the way that traumatic events draw a map of connections in the brain, is my near drowning in the hotel pool. My father was always reading, and so I imagine he must have gone inside to retrieve a book, leaving my mother poolside as I splashed in the shallow end. I don't recall how I ended up in the deeper section. For what seemed a long moment, I was suspended there, looking up through a ceiling of water, the high sun barely visible overhead. I don't recall being afraid as I sank, only that I was enthralled by what I could see through that strange and wavering lens. My mother, who could not swim, leaning over the edge, arms outstretched, reaching for me. She was in the line of the sun, and what she did not block radiated around her head, her face like an annular eclipse, dark and ringed with light. I have just one photograph as a record of our journey. In it, I am alone. There are mountains in the distance behind me, and I am sitting on a mule. On the back, in my father's elegant script, Tasha, Monterey, 1969. Of all the photographs of my early childhood, this one, I can see it now, shows me what each of my parents, in different ways, needed me to know. It was my father's idea to place me on the back of the mule, my father who, perhaps oblivious to his own metaphors of animal husbandry, had referred to me in one of his poems as a crossbreed. The photograph was perhaps his version of a linguistic joke, the sight gag of a mixed-race child writing her namesake, animal origin of the word mulatto. My mother, knowing very well what the visual metaphor meant, could not have thought it was funny. They would have agreed only that I needed to understand it. You are not safe in science. You are not safe in history. Whatever hope she'd had early on, when they were first in love and thinking that love might be enough to counter the challenges of racism I would face, the country had by then shown her otherwise, that love alone would not protect me. She knew that as a mixed-race child, halfway between them, I would ultimately be alone in the journey toward an understanding of self, my place in the world, yet carrying the invisible burdens of history borne on the back of metaphor. She knew, too, that language would be used to name and thereby attempt to constrain me, mongrel, mulatto, half-breed, nigger, and that, as on the back of the mule, I would be both bound to and propelled by it. My mother wanted only that I not be destroyed by it. Thank you. So my name is Danzy Senna.
Yeah, we're dressed alike on purpose. It's a performance art. That was such a gorgeous reading, and I've been rereading your book the last few weeks, and you mentioned Eudora Welty in your intro, and I don't know if it's the same essay I'm thinking of about place and fiction, and she talks about like the only 5 words that should never be in a novel are once upon a time, because it renders the novel outside of a specific time and place. And listening to this particular section you just read, I was thinking about how, in a way, it's so specific to the year you were born and the particular, configuration of your family, that you would be sort of hyper aware of the historical resonance. And I have that same feeling. Like, if you're born mixed race before a certain year, like, you realize that if you were born 2 years later, it would be a different situation. Like, each year matters so much in the scheme of things. But it's sort of also this gift you have as a writer, because that's what I'm always, trying to impart on my students, that it's important as a fiction writer, a memoir writer, to realize what year you were born and what was happening around you. And just maybe you can speak to that. And that's informed so much of your work. And I think it's something that sort of should be something everyone should be thinking about, but you specifically have done that so beautifully.
Yeah, thank you, Danzy. I love that you started with Eudora Welty and those words that should never be, because they, as you say, sort of remove us from the fact that that historical moment is so important. It's important not only because it shapes us, it shapes how we view the world, but it also continues to tell us things about our present moment. I mean, anytime I read that section, I'm always struck by how, even though I'm talking about half a century ago, so much of it has an increasing resonance right now. As I think about contests over Confederate memorials, things that, often people think have been settled a long time ago, are reemerging as some of the biggest fights we're having right now. Issues around civil rights, the way that even in the language that was used against same-sex marriage was the same language deployed against interracial marriage. And so looking at history for me is always also a way of looking exactly at the present moment.
Yeah. And there's something about, the description of your parents getting married and all the sort of symbolism placed on that union that I also really relate to, where it's like the interracial family, the biracial child of that union representing this sort of new era in American history and the sort of liberation to marry who you want to marry, and then you become the symbol of this. And what I love about this book, one of the many things I love about it, is how it complicates that idea of progress so deeply, and like this isn't the way the story ends.
Right.
And
Well, I mean, I think of my mother, that symbolism that you're talking about, my grandmother needing to document this important moment, the loving decision, the hopefulness that my parents had as young people in love at that moment, the height of advancements in the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, the 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. It was a moment to really anticipate all of these changes that had been set in motion. And yet, it wasn't long before my mother could even see that that sort of youthful hopefulness she had was not going to materialize as quickly or with exactly the contours that she imagined.
Yeah.
I mean, she's been dead for, over 35 years now. I think she'd be rather surprised to see the steps backwards we seem to have taken.
Right. And your mother is such an amazing figure and person. That was the other thing that struck me reading this again, was just all of the things she does to protect herself and you. I mean, just the strength of her, and the work that she's doing is also so amazing. And just maybe you can just talk about your mother. She's just really struck me as this very sort of complex but also sort of powerful person.
Since writing this memoir, the hardest thing to do is to talk about my mother. Something you said earlier about working on having to sort of, for the sake of a script, for example, rewrite a book you've already written and said exactly the way you want to say it. And I think that that's the case with my mother, that I spent an entire book trying to tell the world who she was, that sometimes if I attempt to describe her, the emotion of that is so much closer to the surface that I like to talk about things that make me angry instead, so that I don't cry. So let me just tell you something about my mother that I think is useful information about her story and her strength and what she tried to do with her life. Obviously, my mother was a victim of domestic violence. She wasn't a victim. I wish there were another way to say that. But domestic violence is one of those things that people still don't quite understand. And there is still a lot of victim blaming. And even when I talk about this book, there are moments where people ask me really ridiculous questions about domestic violence. One of the things that suggests the strength of my mother is that she did everything right. Often people who work in trying to end domestic violence use this troubling, problematic phrase, perfect victim, to describe my mother, because she did everything right. She left, she got a divorce, she worked with the police, she worked with the district attorney, she refused to go back to him, and also My mother was educated. She was a professional woman. She had resources, both financial and social. She had all of the kinds of things that you would think if someone has, they should be able to get away and survive. But she didn't, which always makes me think that how can we tell poor women or women who are dependent upon their abusers for shelter? Think about how many people were sheltering with their abusers during the pandemic. People who are dependent on their abusers for the care of their children. If a woman like my mother can't get away with her life, how can we tell those women that they can? And another misconception, people are always like, well, you know, they made their bed, they should lie in it. Why did she get involved? You know, why don't they, you know, just leave? The chances of dying at the hands of an abuser go up to over 70-some%. Not when you stay, but when you leave. So my mother's great strength was also in the fact that she knew she was risking her life by leaving, by getting her children out of that situation. That is strength. That was my mother.
I was also struck by how much she loved her work and drew meaning from her work. And that was really beautiful, the work she was doing, too. I was also just listening to you, really interested in the theme that keeps coming up of muteness, silence, struck dumb. And I was thinking, you know, you were a poet for all of these years before you wrote this memoir, and the themes and the sort of matter of this come into your poetry, of course, but I'm curious about like the moment you decided to go into this directly in the form of prose and what that choice was about in terms of genre and language and even geography.
Well, you know, because I'm an autobiographical poet, there were ways that I was at least contending with the grief in poems, writing a lot of elegies, but never going, for the most part, until the new poems in Monument, my new and selected, that I was writing while writing this, did I begin to address straight on this domestic violence and her murder in poems. The reason that I had to do it in prose was, for me, very plain. I never intended to write a memoir, but the more attention I received as a poet after the Pulitzer, after being named Poet Laureate, I was being written about by journalists, you know, by critics, and always my backstory would be part of what they'd write. And when my backstory was mentioned, my mother was mentioned as an afterthought, a victim, this murdered woman. And I felt that she was being erased and diminished, and was not being seen as the remarkable person that she was, who shaped me, who made me the person that I am. And I decided that if she was going to continue to be mentioned, I was going to be the one to tell the story and to tell it properly and to put her in her proper place as the reason I'm a writer.
And do you feel you had to leave Atlanta to write the story and be in another geographic space?
Well, I suppose in some ways that I had to go to Atlanta to write it, because I had, you know, as I said, vowed never to return, never wanted to return. And it seems a strange kind of happenstance that's just where I got a job, and I found myself back in that geography that I needed to get away from. And yet, the physical geography of it, I think, helped me to see that no matter where I wasn't going to be able to escape it. You know, there's a line in a poem of mine in that book, Monument. It's a poem called Letter to Inmate. So it's a poem addressed to my former stepfather. And there's a line in it that reads, well, it's because, I'm sorry, in the poem I'm back in the Delta, and I am being reminded of the happy times of my life in Mississippi. And it's this moment I get a call from the parole board telling me that he's going to get out. Right. And it just smacks right into me listening to The Temptations, Just My Imagination on the radio, which is my mother's favorite song. And it shifts me from the happy daughter of my young mother to daughter of sorrow, daughter of the murdered woman. And so the line reads, "Is there no place I might go and not find you there too?" Like everywhere I go, she's with me, but so is he.
Right. That's one of the things that, even in that story you just told, there's so many coincidences in this book. And even in your life in general, I feel like I was reading it thinking, there's probably coincidences in all our lives, but it's the poet that's going to see them and name them.
Right. Didn't Louis Pasteur write that chance favors the prepared mind?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And like the Memorial Drive and the music playing, and then when you return to Atlanta and you're in this restaurant and these amazing stories throughout, even The Psychic, which is one of my favorite stories in this book, you all have to enjoy on your own. But there's just so many remarkable coincidences that I had a professor say to me once in my MFA program, and it was a fiction class, and he said, "There's too many coincidences in your novel. Coincidences don't work in fiction, but they're great in memoir."
All right.
So it works. And I know I just want to see if there are questions from the audience, because I had another question for you. And this is kind of going back to a conversation we had many years ago, where you talked about a professor you had and him telling you, that you were writing too much, and I may be forgetting this, but you were writing either too much about race or too much about your mother, and that you shouldn't get stuck on these things. And this idea of like, that to become a fully realized writer, first of all, that implicit in it is that you become a white man, and you don't sort of think about these things. It's sort of implicit in that story, but also just, how did you kind of respond to that, and what is your thinking on that, and is that something you've heard many times, and what do we do with those voices coming at us as writers?
So literally what he said was, unburden yourself of being black, unburden yourself of the death of your mother, and write about something else, maybe like the situation in Northern Ireland. Just pour your heart out in the poems. What did I do? I wrote a book called Native Guard about my mother, about grief, about the Deep South, about the Confederacy and history and being born black and biracial in that place, and I won a Pulitzer for it. That's what I did.
Okay.
It does make me think how many times we, as teachers of writing, have these moments where we can say something that might destroy the potential of a young writer. Or we say something that sets them on a course. If I hadn't been as resilient, I might have been destroyed by that. But instead, it set me on a course.
Right.
And I learned, I think, from him even more the kind of professor I didn't want to be. I hear so many stories when people tell me that they were told that what they were writing wasn't poetry. I have never told anybody anything like that.
Yeah, it's like you want, as a writing teacher, to follow the same rules of of a doctor, like first do no harm, get out of their way, in a sense, But also just the idea that, that anybody's not writing about race. It's the idea that, like, these things where it's all over the text, but the person writing it may not even know it.
Well, that's what Toni Morrison told us in Playing in the Dark, right? I mean, it's woven through. It is the thread of America.
Exactly.
And to not write about it is kind of a privilege if you don't think you have to write about it. I was at a panel one time, and one of the white male writers on the panel said to me, if I'd wanted to confront my whiteness, I'd have played basketball, because he didn't think that he had to address race. He thought that whiteness meant that he was privileged and thus did not have to address it, without understanding that that position itself is a position based on an ideology of whiteness.
Right. Well, that goes back to Eudora Welty's essay where she talks about, people only say regional writer when they're talking about Southerners.
Oh, that's right.
And the, New York writers don't get called regional writers, and it's the same idea with like ethnic fiction or, that some writing is racialized and others is somehow given this.
Right. Well, that professor of mine also told me I didn't want to be thought of as a Southern writer, so I needed to kind of stop doing that
all
too.
those marks. Yeah.
But and then when you're a black writer and you're also a Southerner, it's hard for people to figure out what to call you. Sometimes they just call black writers urban, and I'm not urban.
Like a radio station.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there questions from the audience? Please feel free to line up here if you are.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I'm really enjoying the conversation and also the reading. I have one question. I've been reading the memoir, read the memoir when it came out, and I'm actually going to be teaching it next week in the Survey of American Literature. And one of the things I've been asking my students to be thinking about is how you so surprisingly open up the memoir to these other documents, right? And your voice then takes a little bit of a backseat for a moment. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about that gesture of including transcripts and letters, and that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So the question is about, as you heard, those places where I use other kinds of documentary evidence. Particularly, I use a statement that my mother made to the police the first time he kidnapped and attempted to murder her. I include the transcripts of conversations that she had with him 2 days before her death that she needed to record for the district attorney's office so that they could get a warrant. She had to have evidence that he was making terroristic threats or the judge wouldn't issue a warrant for his arrest. And the third document was a 12-page narrative about her marriage and her escape from it that was found in her briefcase the morning she was killed. It was a hard decision for me to use those because somehow I had this idea that readers might think that I was lazy because I wasn't somehow dramatizing what the text of those documents was telling me. But what it came down to was the need to give what I thought was a kind of incontrovertible truth. As a daughter who clearly adored her mother, I felt that I could be sort of an unreliable narrator in a sense, that I could tell you how remarkable she was, how stoic, how determined, how resilient. But you might just think that any daughter would say that about a beloved parent. I wanted you to see it in her own words, to hear it in her voice, so that the incontrovertible truth of it, of who she was presented as documentary evidence and not just my opinion about it.
It's incredibly powerful, and I think it was a great...
I think the police, the records, the transcripts were much longer. I actually had to condense them. And sometimes they're even worse in their repetitiveness, how often he is telling her she's going to die, telling her that she has a choice, and the choice is come back to him or die. Enjoy what little fucking life you have left, he writes in one part. He says, I mean. They are so difficult to read. And so that was one of the hardest things I had to do, to condense them, to put them there so that they could be seen. But I never wanted to read them again. But they are evidence of her great strength.
Yeah, and it's like so sort of strange because the ghostliness of it, like she's left these here.
Yeah.
And wants these records of what has happened and what someone has, and it's just incredible to have them laid out like that.
I think they tell us something too. I mean, to go back to my, point about domestic violence and victims of domestic violence, it is really a testimony. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it allows people to see the inner workings of that kind of relationship with a woman who is determined
She is determined
to get out, and she will not even acquiesce just to get him to stop. She won't agree to that at all.
And when he tries to twist her words, she says, "No, I did not say that."
Nope,
Yeah,
nope,
she's amazing.
she pushes back at every
Amazing.
turn. And I think, the ghostliness of it, as you say, also has to do with sort of the structure for me of the book. I wanted from the opening page for the reader to know that she was dead, so that it's not a big reveal, it's not a crime story, a crime novel or something like that. It is what I wanted to do was to have her live on those pages. Mm-hmm. Have her live in such a way that even though you know the outcome, with every page, you hope beyond hope that she actually survives it.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us tonight. My question is, you talked a little bit about how that feeling that you are never able to escape him, and in a lot of places you go, you can find him in one way or another. My question is, has there been any safe spaces for you that you're able to feel really at home in, or how have you learned to create safe spaces maybe in your life where whether it's geographical or situational, how have you learned to create those spaces?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So because I can't escape memory, because there are things, the way memory comes back to us because we hear a song or we smell something or we taste something that brings us back to a particular place, I'll never be able to escape that. But the place that I suppose I feel most at home, or the place that I feel safest, is in the language of a poem, in the language that I make. Because even if I'm writing about, or in this memoir, I'm writing about something traumatic, something that happened that when I was a child, I was not in control of. I am absolutely in control of the language I use to retell it, to shape it, the lens through which I imagine it, and retell the story, to take ownership of the story of my life and not have it dictated to me by someone who was abusive.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Hello, it's so
Hello.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Intersectionality, of course, is like a huge theme throughout most of your works. And I just wanted to know, was it always something as a writer that you knew you were going to talk about, or was it something you kind of had to experience throughout your time writing?
Help me a little bit more with your question. I mean, I know what the word means, but
Oh, it's like the combination of different identities. So you were a Black woman and Southerner, and you had a lot of lived experience. So it's kind of like at a crossroads
Right.
as to where all these things will unite.
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful. I've been recently writing about the crossroads. And this is one of those coincidences again, that I was, literally the first house I entered after I left the hospital on the day after Confederate Memorial Day was at a crossroads. It was the crossroads of Highway 49, which is legendary highway of the blues, and Jefferson Street, named after our third president. So it's also a kind of crossroads of sort of classical knowledge and the vernacular, which represents one of the many different intersectional crossroads in my own life. But even as I'm interested in the crossroads like that, and also because I am biracial and always interested in the crossroads, it's never felt like anything but the integration of self for me. Like, I can't sit down and say, well, today I'm going to put on my hat as a woman and write from that perspective, or I'm going to put on my hat as a Black woman, or I'm going to put on my hat as a biracial person. Or they're all always there with me. And I think it is indeed that crossroads and intersectionality of my own existence that gives the kind of vision that I have for the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe last one?
One more? Yeah,
Last
one more
question?
question.
Hello, thank you so much for this experience. I'm actually from Decatur, Georgia, and my grandmother actually lives on Memorial Drive, so this is really nice. So I guess I kind of had asking you if you had some advice for as a Black woman from the South when writing your memoir. There's so many different pivotal experiences we have as a child, so what kind of helped you decide what you wanted to include in your memoir to tell the bigger story?
That's a great question. I read so many memoirs when I was working on mine to teach myself how to do it, including Danzy Senna's great memoir, Where Did You Sleep Last Night? But I also read a textbook by Vivian Gornick called The Situation and the Story. And this really helped me a lot because at some point, she talks about how, the situation of your life is one thing, but when you go to write a memoir, the story is something very different. So I sat down and I put on a sheet of paper one column, situation, and the other column, story. It was easy to fill up the situation because I knew that my situation was that I was Black and biracial, born in the Deep South, that my parents had divorced and my mother remarried, and I grew up in a house of domestic violence, and my mother was murdered, and I have spent the rest of my adult life in a kind of state of bereavement. That's my situation. but that's not the story. So what story was I going to tell? It took a long time to figure out from that situation, what is the story I need to tell? And as you pointed out, we have so many experiences. How do you pick and choose from them so that you can write a memoir? You have to figure out the story you're going to tell. And then all of the things you choose are the things that go toward telling that story. And I liken it always, and I mentioned this earlier today, to the idea of that moment when the ancients first looked up at the stars and they saw a sky full of them before they started drawing lines between them to connect them to make a constellation. The story you're going to tell is the constellation that you make of all the stars, all the little experiences of your life. So figure out the story, and then the situation has so much material to offer you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, that was beautiful.
Hello.
Hi there.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's a really nice experience to hear, to listen to you, to
Thank
talk
you.
about your own story.
Thank you.
And this is actually my first time reading and knowing a memoir. I've never really read about memoir like this genre before, and I'm surprised by how powerful and how impactful it can be. And I guess my question is a bit similar to the last question, but I'm just wondering, when you are writing the memoir, how do you think about the process? Because all the stories, they all weave in together so perfectly, and it makes such an emotional impact that actually strike people's heart. So I'm just thinking, when you're writing, do you think about the impact of the story first, or do you think about the timeline of the story, and how much do you think you put the objectivity in the story, and how do you balance between your emotion and the subjectivity of the story?
Oh, that's a great lot of questions. Thank you. I have to say that I was thinking about this in the way that I think about writing a poem. It felt like writing a long poem that I wanted to have certain images that would find their way, work out throughout the book so that readers would see them again and it would return to something. I wanted these motifs to go throughout the whole book. I wanted the lyricism of a poem. But the question about emotion is a good one. During the pandemic, I did a Zoom with a group of psychiatrists, psychoanalysts in New York who had read the book and they wanted to talk to me about it. And, the first thing they said was, oh, it's really brave for you to show up to have this conversation with a group of psychoanalysts. I said, what's scary about y'all? I stand in audiences full of college students. So one of the moments in it, someone was saying that she kept saying, oh, you wrote it with the emotion. How could you put so much emotion? What was that like for you? And I kept saying, well, it's about craft. It's about the scaffolding of how I'm telling this story. And she kept saying, no, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about how the emotion hit me. I said, I did that. That's what the writing is. That's what the craft is, figuring out how to tell the story. And even when you sketch out parts of it, and then you begin to see possibilities for other metaphors or other images. One of my favorites, I have to say it like that because it's troubling, but there's something that is woven throughout the book. The first time it appears, I talk about this idea of birthmarks, of being marked or imprinted. I also talk about threshold a lot. There's a moment in the first chapter, I'm describing my mother when her maternal grandmother comes down to New Orleans to verify the paternity. She wants to see if my mother has this red birthmark back at the back of her head, at the base of her skull, that she has passed to her other descendants. and my mother does have the birthmark. Later on, I write about watching my mother get dressed in the evening, and I describe the little curl of hair at the nape of her neck that made her look vulnerable, as if no amount of armor could shield such a delicate spot. I'm sort of using the idea of Achilles, that delicate spot he had where his mother dipped him and didn't get it all, the water that would protect him from being wounded in battle, but she doesn't get his heel in. And of course, that's where he gets his mortal wound. And then later on, when I am talking about when she's finally murdered and the bullet that goes through her raised hand and lodges right inside of her skull at the base behind the blood-red bloom of her birthmark, I have shown you that 3 times, that spot, throughout the book. I didn't know that. I didn't write that immediately as I went through. It was only after seeing the metaphors that were going on ahead of me, as Mark Doty says, that I could then go back and choose the details that would help carry that through.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we better take these last 2 so you good people can go.
Yeah, I was thinking about the hearing the writing as a transmutation of the internal world, internal life, and the shift in the general world of the transmutation that's transpiring in the greater universe. Could you address that?
Okay, help me with that one. That's
Well, you know, it's like the historian Dr. Gerald Horne says that the movement of the world is going back to Africa in a general way. And I was wondering how this thing is going, this writing you're doing is going back to your original origins of consciousness.
Oh, well, you know, I think that's a good question. You know, somebody asked me about dreams earlier, and in the reading I gave tonight, you know, I talk about my earliest dream, but I also talk about the earliest memory I think I have, and I'm using this to sort of think about going back to origins. The earliest memory that I have, I read about it tonight, was the memory of I was 3 years old and I almost drowned in that pool in Mexico. And I can remember in that moment looking up and seeing my mother, not being afraid, and it was the way that her face, her head, was directly in front of the sun. So she was blocking it. So for the most part, all I could see was that little bit of sun from where she was blocking it, as if it was radiating from her. Now, that was the image that I had as a 3-year-old, and I don't know if I had seen and was cognizant of seeing images of the Virgin with her corona of light around her head. But that was the same kind of image that I saw when I looked up at my mother. It was as if that image at that moment was my conversion moment, and that I would understand later on that the thing I was called to do was to tell this story, was to write this.
It's a transpersonal experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe I've given it that meaning and metaphor over the years as I've tried to make sense of my own life, but the image itself was the first thing I remember, my earliest memory as a child, and it has such meaning for where I am now.
Okay, that's good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hey, Natasha.
Hey.
You spoke before about professors who have the potential to destroy somebody's potential. What advice would you have for people who've had those experiences with instructors and have heard really discouraging comments?
Well, you know, even in my situation, the good part, beyond, personal resilience, is that when you're in an institution like this, you are still part of a community. And that one professor isn't enough to isolate anyone from that community. The moment that he said that to me, I marched right down the hall and found John Edgar Wideman's door open. And I went in there and I told him. And John, who has had many struggles and traumas in his own family life, looked at me and he said, "You have to write about what you have to write about." So immediately, someone else counteracted that other message. And so I do think it is about seeking out the mentors who do no harm, but also perhaps have some affinity with your story, who can at least hear your concerns. Like I said, I learned the kind of professor I didn't want to be from that experience. I'll say this, and I'm going to stop. In workshop, I'll never forget this. And if any of you out here see yourselves, forgive me. But this professor of mine, somebody would read a poem, and he had two responses. One was, "You nailed it." And then we'd never have any conversation about why they nailed it. And I'm a student. I'm like, okay, well, why did they nail it? Can you tell me about what issues of craft you think nailed it? His other one was, well, at least you can salvage the title. I do not do that. And there are plenty of people that don't. And there are other people to seek out because you are a part of this community.
Thank you.
And Natasha's going to be signing her book, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.